Over the last few years, SpaceX has sent a lot of satellites to space. Their goal of building a constellation of satellites is coming along nicely, and just this year, they've launched hundreds of these tiny satellites. However, Starlink has had to face accusations of space pollution. Today on Super Freaky Science, we'll be checking out the validity of these claims, and we'll be telling you if Starlink satellites do cause space pollution. First off, if you haven't heard of Starlink before, let's quickly run through what the entire thing is about. Starlink is a satellite internet constellation that will be constructed by SpaceX. The goal of the constellation will be to provide satellite internet access. The satellite constellation will consist of thousands of small satellites in low Earth orbit. These satellites will work in conjunction with land-based receivers. This sounds like an ambitious goal, and it is. SpaceX estimates that it would take about $10 billion in total to launch all the satellites. You may be wondering how SpaceX will recoup the huge amount of money it plans to sink into this constellation. Well, the answer is pretty easy. The company plans to sell some of the satellites for scientific, military, and exploratory purposes. The product development started way back in 2015, and by 2018, 2 prototype test flight satellites were launched. By early 2020, SpaceX was already launching about 60 satellites at a time, and the company aims to have deployed 570 pounds of spacecraft by 2022. Before SpaceX started launching these spacecraft, they said that the satellites were essentially experimental, as they have never been tested in space before. Importantly, they stressed that the satellites had a high risk of failure. This, of course, got some alarm bells in the industry ringing. Concerns for space debris. Soon after SpaceX started launching these satellites, several organisations started raising concerns about the long-term dangers of space debris. Of course, you're thinking that satellites aren't space debris, but in the long term, it's easy for them to be. Aside from these, it appears that these satellites might hurt the optical and radio astronomers of the Earth. The International Astronomical Union released a statement to that effect. Their statement said that satellite constellations were tolerable when there were less than 200 satellites in the sky. But as the number of satellites continue to increase, they may soon outnumber all previously launched satellites. According to the organisation, embracing the principles of a dark and radio-quiet sky is not only essential to advancing our understanding of the universe, of which we are part of, but it's also essential for the protection of nocturnal wildlife. Since we don't yet understand the impact of these artificial lights scattered all over the night sky, it's not inconceivable that these high reflections are satellites that may threaten our observations of the universe and nocturnal wildlife. Scientific concerns. There are 2 main scientific concerns about the Starlink constellation. The first one is about the highly reflective nature of the satellites. Since they are highly reflective, the reflection from the sun in the hours after sunset and before the sunrise makes them appear as slow-moving dots in the night sky. Now, these reflections will almost definitely be picked up with the naked eye. However, they can be detrimental to the sensitive capabilities of large ground-based astronomical telescopes. These include the Extreme Wide-Angle Survey Telescope currently under construction. Additionally, astronomers claim that the number of visible satellites may outnumber visible stars, and their brightness may impact scientific observation severely. This may not be such a big problem if the Starlink satellites cannot autonomously change their orbit. However, they can, and this means that observations cannot be scheduled to avoid them. The second concern is about radio frequencies. Even though SpaceX has gone through great pain to avoid interfering with radio astronomy frequencies, aggregate radio signals emitted from the satellite constellations can still threaten astronomical observations at radio wavelengths. Now, you may think that this isn't that important, but a radio-free sky isn't just a slogan. In fact, it's rather crucial to many advances in astronomy. For example, recent advances in astronomy like the first image of a black hole or the further understanding of the formation of planetary systems were only possible through a radio sky free from interference. If Starlink is completed, they may have to bid farewell to a radio-free sky for the foreseeable future. Space debris. Aside from the light and radio pollution that these satellites may cause, the actual satellites themselves contribute space debris. And space debris runs the risk of causing a satellite collision and may potentially trigger a phenomenon known as the Kessler syndrome. The Kessler syndrome is basically a theoretical situation where the density of an object in low Earth orbit due to space pollution is high enough that collisions between objects could cause a cascade in which each collision generates space debris that increases the likelihood of further collisions. If this happens, the cascade of debris could render space activities and the use of satellites in specific locations impossible for many years. Importantly, SpaceX has said that it anticipates a 5% failure rate for each batch of satellites launched. This means that there could be potentially hundreds of satellites floating aimlessly across the sky without rhyme or reason. These concerns are important and must be taken seriously since they affect the present and future of space exploration. However, it would be unfair to talk about these concerns without talking about the solutions that SpaceX has put forward. SpaceX's solution to space pollution. SpaceX has taken note of the concerns raised by these organisations and has taken some steps to minimise the effect that their satellites may have on the night sky. First off, SpaceX decided to solve the space debris situation. To solve that problem, they decided that they would lower the range at which the satellite orbited at. Instead of orbiting at 1150 kilometers above the Earth as originally planned, SpaceX got approval from the Federal Communications Commission to orbit their satellites at 550 kilometers. This means that even if the satellites failed, SpaceX would be able to deorbit them within 5 years without propulsion. Interestingly, SpaceX said that this was a move done to decrease latency, not explicitly because of the possibilities of the satellites contributing to space debris. Most stakeholders didn't care about the reason SpaceX gave for making that move, they were just happy that the move had been made. The next problem that SpaceX tried to solve is the light pollution problem. Given that this problem was harmful, it was important that SpaceX found a solution to it, and quickly too. When the company first discovered that their satellites might be messing with astronomical observations, they took the problem seriously, even though it was a problem that none of their engineers had seen coming. Within a few months, the company had come up with a seemingly simple solution. They were going to coat their satellites in materials that were not as reflective. To do this, they first had to test if the materials would work in making the satellites less reflective. To do this, they took one of their satellites and coated it with a special material designed to make spacecrafts less reflective and less likely to interfere with space observations. The launchings were successful, and Starlink has now continued adding satellites that are not reflective. Additionally, SpaceX said that they would continue to test new methods of mitigating light pollution and provide access to satellite tracking data for astronomers to coordinate their observations with their satellites better. So it appears that SpaceX does want to reduce the adverse effects that their satellites would have on the environment. As SpaceX continues to launch satellites, the effect that their satellites have on the environment may continue to grow. But as long as SpaceX is determined to reduce the effects of their satellites have on the environment, things should be alright. Well, as alright as conceivable anyway. One thing is certain though, SpaceX and other space companies will not stop sending satellites to space. What they can do, though, is ensure that these satellites are low enough to deorbit properly and are not reflective. If they do this, they will be doing the field of astronomy a great service. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to smash the like and subscribe buttons. That's it for today, guys. Goodbye, and remember to look at the sky, wish upon a star while you can. In the next few years, you may only be able to wish on those satellites.